You might be the reason someone like that hasn't been sleeping properly for a while. And the strange part is, you may not even realize it yet. This is the person who once made you doubt your own thoughts, question your memory, and second guess every decision you made. The one who slowly pushed you into shrinking yourself, choosing silence over honesty just to avoid conflict. They always needed to be right, always needed control, and somehow you were always the one left feeling responsible for everything that went wrong. Now, even if you're not watching them, something in their world feels unsettled. Not because something dramatic happened, but because you stopped engaging in the pattern they relied on. And that shift, quiet as it is, creates a disruption they don't easily recover from. Most people misunderstand what it actually means to win against someone like this. They imagine a dramatic ending where everything is said out loud, where there's a final confrontation, apologies, or some emotional breakdown that confirms the truth. But real freedom doesn't look like that at all. It's not loud or theatrical, and it doesn't need validation from the other person. The real shift happens in silence, when you stop reacting the way you used to and step out of the role they assigned you. What changes first isn't their behavior in an obvious way, but the pressure building in their system as they lose access to your responses. That's where the first signs start to appear, not in your life, but in theirs. One of the earliest signs is the sudden rise of a smear campaign. At first, it can feel disorienting, even unfair, because it looks like things are getting worse for you socially. You might hear that they're talking about you to mutual connections, twisting details, or telling versions of events that don't match reality. People you barely know may suddenly have opinions about you that feel completely out of nowhere. But this isn't random. It's damage control. When they feel you slipping out of their influence, they try to rebuild control through narrative. Their sense of power depends heavily on how others perceive them. And when you stop playing your part in that story, they rush to fill the gaps with whatever keeps them looking stable. What's really happening underneath this behavior is what psychologists often refer to as narcissistic injury. It's a deep internal rupture that happens when the image they hold of themselves is challenged or no longer reinforced by the outside world. When that injury is triggered, it doesn't lead to reflection or accountability. Instead, it usually turns outward as defensiveness, anger, or manipulation of perception. The smear campaign is just one expression of that response, shaped into something social and indirect. The louder and more desperate it becomes, the more it signals that they are struggling to regain the control they lost when you stopped participating in their version of reality. Another major sign is what's commonly called hoovering. It happens after silence, distance, or when their earlier attempts to control the narrative don't give them the result they wanted. Suddenly they reappear. Sometimes it comes in the form of a message that feels unexpectedly soft or even caring, like nothing ever happened. Other times it's more subtle, a casual check-in, a nostalgic reminder, or a message designed to reopen a door you thought was closed. The goal isn't genuine reconnection, it's re-entry into your emotional space. It's their way of testing whether the access they lost can still be recovered, even slightly, because for them, losing that access is far more destabilizing than they let on. Sometimes that hoovering doesn't come directly from them at all. It shows up as an emergency, real or exaggerated, something urgent that suddenly demands your attention. Other times it's indirect, carried through mutual connections. You hear things like they've changed, or they've been asking about you, or they don't seem like themselves anymore. To understand why this happens, you have to look at what drives the system underneath it. A narcissistic psychological structure relies heavily on what's often called narcissistic supply: attention, emotional reactions, admiration, and a sense of influence or control over others. In your presence, they had a steady source of that. When you leave without chaos or continued engagement, it creates a kind of internal disruption, not because of emotional attachment in the healthy sense, but because a functional role in their psychological pattern is suddenly gone. The hoovering itself isn't an act of reconciliation. It's an attempt to reestablish access. It's a way of testing whether the connection, or at least your responsiveness, can still be activated. Recognizing that distinction is part of reclaiming your clarity. Then comes another pattern, the performance phase. This is where things become more visible, especially from a distance. They start broadcasting their life in a way that feels unusually amplified. New relationships, new achievements, sudden bursts of happiness shared publicly, all carefully presented as if they are meant to be seen by a specific audience. And often, that audience is you. This connects to something in psychology sometimes described as proxy influence. When direct emotional control is no longer available, the attempt shifts toward shaping how you perceive them through other people and public signals. Research in personality psychology has noted that individuals with strong narcissistic traits often increase self-promotional behavior on social platforms after relational breakdowns. The content typically focuses on status, success, or desirability rather than genuine reflection or healing. Because real recovery doesn't need an audience. It doesn't require validation or performance. It's quiet, internal, and doesn't depend on being seen. Another sign that often gets overlooked is how much their emotional control starts to slip in small, ordinary moments. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in brief interactions where they are caught off guard. A sharp comment at a casual gathering, a sudden irritation in a low-pressure setting, or a facial expression that flashes and disappears too quickly to fully mask. These moments matter because they reveal a breakdown in the consistency of the image they work so hard to maintain. Narcissistic presentation is usually carefully managed, so when cracks appear in situations that don't seem significant, it suggests internal strain. What you're really seeing in those moments is the tension between the identity they project and whatever emotional instability is underneath it. As that gap widens, more of it leaks through. And when you are no longer emotionally entangled, that gap tends to grow even more because there is nothing left from you reinforcing the version of reality they relied on. At the end of all of this, the real shift was never about defeating someone in a visible way. It was about reaching a point where the dynamic no longer holds emotional weight over you. It's when you can observe it without feeling pulled back into it. Not anger, not validation, not even satisfaction. Just a sense of distance that feels complete. That is what real separation looks like in practice. And if you're somewhere in that process, even if it still feels uneven or uncertain at times, the fact that you can see it differently already means you've moved further than you think. What you're really looking at here is less about a single person losing control and more about what happens when a long-running psychological dynamic stops getting reinforced. In these kinds of relationships, the intensity often comes from a loop. One person reacts, over-explains, tries to fix things, seeks clarity, or emotionally engages, and the other person draws regulation from that reaction. When that loop breaks, especially when it breaks quietly, without drama, it creates instability in the system that used to depend on it. That's why the absence of reaction can feel so disruptive. It removes predictability. If someone is used to certain emotional responses, even negative ones, the sudden silence or neutrality can feel unfamiliar and harder to read. In response, behavior may become more noticeable, not necessarily more intentional in a conscious sense, but more effortful, more messaging, more indirect contact, more attempts to reestablish familiarity. From the outside, it can look strategic, but internally, it's often just an attempt to reduce uncertainty and regain a sense of psychological balance. The idea of supply is often used in simplified explanations, but at its core, it points to something more basic in human behavior. People vary in how much they rely on external feedback to stabilize their self-image. When that feedback is suddenly removed or reduced, some individuals adjust internally over time, while others try to restore it externally. That restoration can take many forms: direct contact, indirect messaging through others, or increased public self-presentation. It doesn't always mean the same intention is behind each action, but the pattern can look similar from the outside. Another layer that often gets missed is how perception becomes part of the dynamic. When you're inside the situation, everything feels personal and targeted. But when you step back, you start to see that a lot of the behavior is less about you specifically and more about what you represent in that person's internal system: stability, validation, control, or emotional engagement. That shift in perspective is important because it separates identity from role. You stop being the cause and start seeing yourself as someone who is part of a repeating pattern that no longer has to continue. Over time, when the pattern isn't reinforced, both sides tend to change, but in very different ways. One side may escalate attempts to restore familiarity, while the other side slowly detaches and recalibrates their emotional baseline. That recalibration is subtle. It often shows up as reduced emotional spikes, fewer intrusive thoughts, and less urgency to make sense of the past. Not because everything is resolved, but because the nervous system stops treating it as something ongoing. What eventually matters most isn't decoding every behavior or trying to assign certainty to every action. It's recognizing when your attention is no longer automatically pulled into the cycle. That moment, when you can observe without feeling compelled to respond, correct, or re-engage emotionally, is usually the point where the dynamic loses its grip. Not because the other person changed in a dramatic way, but because your internal response to the pattern stopped feeding it. When people say they got out but still feel pulled back in, that experience is actually very common, and it has less to do with the other person doing something new and more to do with how the brain processes emotional conditioning. What happens in these dynamics is that your nervous system learns a pattern of high emotional activation, followed by relief, confusion, hope, disappointment, or sudden calm. That inconsistency is important. The brain tends to remember unpredictable rewards and emotional shifts more strongly than stable ones. So even when the situation is no longer present, the internal system can still expect another emotional spike or resolution. That expectation is what creates the feeling of being pulled back in, even without contact. There's also something called attachment activation. When a bond has been intense, the brain can keep scanning for cues related to it long after the situation ends. A message, a memory, a mutual connection, or even boredom can briefly reactivate that old pathway. It doesn't mean you want the person back in a clear, rational way. It's more like the system is briefly rerunning an old program because it hasn't fully been overwritten yet. Another layer is unfinished emotional processing. If things ended without clarity, accountability, or closure, the mind often keeps trying to solve it, not because there is a real solution still missing, but because uncertainty feels cognitively incomplete. That's why overthinking tends to spike after distance. The brain prefers a painful explanation over an unresolved question. Over time, these reactions weaken as new emotional experiences build different patterns. The pull doesn't usually disappear in one moment. It fades as your attention, habits, and emotional focus get redirected consistently elsewhere. What used to feel urgent starts to feel distant. Then distant turns into irrelevant. And at that point, the old cycle stops having emotional leverage, even if the memory still exists. The fastest way the detachment phase actually strengthens isn't by forcing yourself to stop thinking about it, but by changing what your mind repeatedly returns to afterward. Your brain doesn't really erase emotional patterns through effort or pressure. It weakens them through replacement and repetition. Every time you redirect attention into something stable, routine, goals, conversations that don't trigger that old emotional loop, you're not distracting yourself in a shallow way. You're literally building new pathways that compete with the old ones. Over time, the newer signals become the default reference point. One thing that often slows people down is mental replay. Going back over conversations, imagining alternative endings, or trying to decode intent keeps the emotional circuit partially active. Not because reflection is bad, but because repetition without resolution keeps the system open-ended. The mind treats it like unfinished data and keeps running background checks on it. Reducing that doesn't require suppression. It usually comes from gently refusing to continue the analysis once it becomes circular and not informative anymore. Another important shift happens when emotional meaning starts separating from identity. At first, people often interpret the experience as something that says something about their worth, judgment, or choices. But detachment accelerates when it becomes just an experience you went through, not a definition of you. That separation reduces emotional charge significantly because the brain stops treating it as a current threat or ongoing evaluation. Your body also plays a role here more than people expect. Stress systems don't fully settle through thinking alone. Sleep consistency, physical movement, and even small daily structure signal safety to the nervous system. When the body stabilizes, the mind follows. Without that, the emotional memory stays more reactive than it needs to be. Eventually, what changes most is your relationship to the memory itself. It stops appearing as something that demands interpretation or resolution and starts existing more like background information. It can still be there, but it no longer pulls attention forward. That's usually the point where people realize they're not trying to heal anymore. They've already shifted past the active phase without noticing it happening in real time. After that stage, what usually comes next is a kind of emotional quiet, not instant happiness, but a noticeable reduction in internal noise. The thoughts don't disappear completely, but they lose urgency. What used to feel like something you had to figure out right now starts to feel more like something you occasionally remember and then move on from without much effort. This is often where people get surprised because they expect a dramatic final break. But instead, they notice small changes. You don't check your phone as often. You don't rehearse conversations in your head as much. Certain triggers that used to create a strong reaction start to feel flat or less significant. That flattening isn't emotional numbness in a negative sense. It's your system no longer treating the past as an active problem. At this point, identity also starts to shift in a subtle way. Earlier, a lot of mental energy was tied to understanding what happened or what it meant. Now that energy begins to return to you, you start thinking more in terms of your own direction instead of interpretation. Even small decisions feel less influenced by the need to undo or fix the past narrative. There can still be occasional waves. A memory, a dream, a random reminder can briefly bring back old feelings. The difference is that these waves don't reset your progress anymore. They pass through without changing your overall state. That's a key sign that the emotional system has reorganized itself rather than just being temporarily distracted. What's also important here is that healing at this stage is not about reaching a permanent state where nothing ever affects you again. It's about stability returning faster each time something does trigger you. The gap between trigger and recovery gets shorter, and the emotional intensity keeps decreasing. Eventually, you reach a point where your attention is no longer oriented around the experience at all. Not because it was erased, but because it no longer serves as a reference point for your present life. Your focus naturally shifts outward again, toward new routines, new goals, and relationships that don't carry the same emotional weight. That's usually when people realize they're not actively recovering anymore. They're simply living, and the past has stopped interrupting that process. What often comes after that is a stage where you start realizing something very important. You didn't just get over a person. You actually changed the way your mind handles emotional attachment altogether. The same situations that once felt consuming now register differently. You can remember them without getting pulled into them. You can even talk about them without feeling that old pressure in your chest or that urge to explain everything perfectly in your head. This is where emotional neutrality starts becoming the default, not something you're trying to force. At this point, clarity replaces confusion. You begin to see the structure of the experience more than the emotional story. Instead of thinking, why did this happen to me? Your mind naturally shifts toward, this is the pattern I went through. That shift might sound small, but psychologically it's significant because it means your brain is no longer organizing the memory around pain, but around understanding. Another subtle change is how your standards start to recalibrate without effort. Things that once felt acceptable in the name of attachment, hope, or loyalty start to feel mismatched with who you are now. Not from anger, but from simple awareness. You don't have to convince yourself of what you deserve. Your reactions already reflect it. What's interesting is that this stage often feels quieter than people expect. There's no big emotional reward moment. Instead, there's just less internal conflict overall. Fewer arguments in your head, fewer imagined scenarios, fewer emotional spikes tied to the past. That quietness can feel unfamiliar at first because your mind was used to intensity, even if it was painful. Over time, that quiet becomes your new baseline. And once that happens, something else naturally follows. Your attention starts to expand outward again. You become more present in your actual life instead of your internal replay. Things that were once emotionally blocked begin to feel accessible again. New experiences, new people, new motivation. And this is usually the point where people realize something simple but powerful. It wasn't about winning, proving anything, or even getting closure in the traditional sense. It was about your system learning that it doesn't need to stay tied to that experience anymore. Once that lesson is integrated, the pull doesn't just weaken, it stops being relevant. After this stage, what really starts to happen is integration. The experience doesn't feel like something you are actively recovering from anymore. And it also doesn't feel like something you need to keep analyzing. It becomes part of your past in a clean, settled way, not because it was fully understood, but because your mind stopped treating it as unfinished business. You might still get occasional memories, but they land differently now. Instead of pulling you into an emotional spiral, they feel more like distant reference points. There's no urgency attached to them, no need to decode them or assign new meaning. That loss of urgency is actually one of the clearest signs that the emotional charge has dissolved at a deep level. What also tends to change here is how you relate to yourself. Earlier in the process, a lot of internal dialogue is focused on what you did wrong, what you missed, or what you should have done differently. In this more integrated phase, that self-judgment starts to soften. You begin to see your responses as understandable, given the emotional environment you were in, rather than as mistakes that define you. There's also a quiet return of trust, but not necessarily trust in other people right away. First, it's trust in your own perception. You stop second-guessing your instincts as much. You start recognizing early signals of discomfort or misalignment without needing external validation to confirm them. That alone changes how you move through relationships and decisions going forward. Another shift is that emotional energy becomes available again in a more stable way, not in bursts of intensity, but in consistency. You can focus longer, connect more easily, and engage with things without that background noise of unresolved emotional processing constantly running underneath. At some point, you notice you're not structuring your present around the past anymore. The past still exists in your memory, but it no longer organizes your emotional life. It doesn't set the tone for your current choices or reactions. That's usually when people realize something subtle but important. They're no longer in transition. They're simply on the other side of it, and life has quietly moved forward without needing permission or closure from what came before. In the end, the real shift has very little to do with the other person and everything to do with what your mind stops doing. It stops replaying, stops scanning for meaning, stops waiting for resolution that never really needed to come from them in the first place. What once felt like emotional chaos slowly turns into clarity, and then clarity turns into distance, and distance eventually turns into peace. There is no dramatic moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It's more like a gradual loss of emotional urgency. The memories are still there, but they stop feeling like something you have to solve. The questions that once felt heavy begin to lose weight, not because they were answered, but because they no longer control your attention. At a deeper level, what changes is your relationship with yourself. You stop interpreting the experience as something that defines you and start seeing it as something you moved through. That alone removes a huge amount of emotional pressure. You begin to trust your own perception again, your own reactions, your own ability to recognize what is and isn't good for you. And eventually, the past just becomes part of your timeline, not your emotional environment. It exists, but it doesn't direct you anymore. It doesn't shape your present mood or your future decisions in the way it once did. That is the quiet ending most people don't expect, not victory in the dramatic sense, not closure handed to you by someone else, but internal freedom that no longer depends on the story continuing in your head.